Zitkala Saw, or Gertrude Bonin as she was known by her missionary name, tells the story of her first day at an Indian boarding school. She traveled by train from the Yankton Sioux Reservation to Wabash, Indiana, at White's Manual Labor Institute. Her first morning there, another student approached her and told her, "They will come for you. They will come for you to cut your hair." Now, Zitkala Saw had been taught that only unskilled warriors who'd been captured in battle had their hair shingled by the enemy. Shingled, think bangs around your face. She would say later in her writings that short hair was worn by mourners and shingled hair by cowards. And with this in mind, she searched for her first opportunity to get away, and when she saw it, she seized it. She ran upstairs to a bedroom with 3 beds and green curtains holding back the light. Searching for a place to hide, she crawled underneath one of the beds, she curled herself up, and she held her breath. She heard the sounds of the approaching students and teachers. Their voices got louder, their footsteps nearer, and when they entered the room, they threw open the closet doors and they threw aside the curtains, letting the room flood with light. She doesn't know why they looked under the bed that night, but they did, and they found her and they grabbed her and dragged her out, kicking, scratching, and screaming loudly. They took her downstairs and they shackled her to a chair, where she cried and she shook. She would forever remember the feeling of the cold blade against her skin, and she would forever hear the sound of them gnawing off her braids. It was then that she lost her spirit, and it was then that she realized they had shingled her hair like a coward's. Now, Zitkala Saw's experience was not unique. It wasn't extraordinary. Thousands of Native Americans from the mid-1880s to around the 1950s were taken from their home and placed in boarding schools and had similar experiences. In fact, one cannot truly understand and appreciate the contemporary circumstances that Native American communities face without understanding the history of federal and state policies targeted at the so-called Indian problem. Tonight I speak of one of these policies, the Indian boarding school policy. And I speak as part of a broader coalition of individuals and organizations, tribal communities, and governments that are seeking to shed light on the truth of what happened and to create the circumstances in which healing can occur. I will speak of the history of boarding schools, as well as their legacy, and talk about one legal mechanism that's been available to families and communities to help this healing process. The United States boarding school policy was part of a larger policy targeting the elimination of all that was native in society. And its goal was the full-scale assimilation into dominant white society. It was a policy of cultural genocide, nothing more. And in fact, it was viewed as a viable alternative to flat-out extermination. It was estimated that the money necessary to fund a military force required to stay in Indian territory was just too damn expensive. And with Quaker and missionary reformers opposed to that sort of violent tactic, it was decided that the best option was to take children away from their families, place them in schools far away from reservations where they could learn the ways of white society, and that this would be the best method for eradicating all vestiges of Native culture in the country. Now, one cannot tell the story of Indian boarding schools without taking a brief tangent to discuss Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt. In 1875, Pratt, who'd spent 8 years in the 10th Cavalry in Indian Territory, rounded up 72 warriors of various tribes, put them on a train, and shipped them to a prison in St. Augustine, Florida. Here, he oversaw their incarceration, he taught them English, and he encouraged Christian conversion. It was this experience that inspired Pratt in 1879 to start the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which would be the first boarding school in the country and the model for subsequent boarding schools throughout the nation. Here in Colorado, we had 2, one in Grand Junction and Fort Lewis in Durango. Pratt is famous for the saying, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And boarding schools run by churches and or the federal government were designed to destroy native cultures, languages, and spirituality. And students that attended boarding schools were forced to accept white culture, the English language, and Christianity. Parents didn't have much of a say as to whether or not to send their children to these boarding schools, and in fact, many resisted. However, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, could withhold food and rations if parents didn't send their children to school. For many families, this was the equivalent of starvation. And by the way, this law is still on the books. In one instance, 19 Hopi men who were labeled as hostiles by the United States Army were rounded up and put in prison in Alcatraz simply for opposing the forced removal and education of their children. Now, once in school, daily life mirrored military training. Students were placed into dormitories where they were controlled, trained, neglected, and abused. They were punished for speaking their native languages. They were banned from participating in cultural and traditional practices, and they were stripped of their clothing, their hair, and all behavior and things that reflected on their cultures. They were also systematically and intentionally inculcated with shame, a shame that many students would internalize as self-loathing or emotional disenfranchisement for their cultures. These are some before and after pictures of students entering boarding schools and after their conversions. Now, these boarding schools, as I said, were nothing but cultural genocide. They were designed to destroy the cultures and the languages and assimilate these native peoples into white society. Sorry. Students were also forced to endure forced labor. In fact, there was what was called an outing program, and students were placed into homes as well as on farms, and often they were exploited. In one instance, the Albuquerque school would send 50 to 100 students daily to harvest crops for a full day in the sweltering heat. And at Carlisle, the students built most of the facilities. The workload imposed on the students compounded the effects of malnutrition, loneliness, and poor living conditions. And many students tried to run away, they got sick, or worse, even died. At Carlisle, for instance, it's estimated that nearly 500 students died, and there were some 1,842 desertions. And if you were caught running away, you'd be punished by beatings, you'd be shackled, and you'd often be placed into a dark, unventilated outbuilding designed as a jail. For those students who eventually did return to their communities, they didn't return as the Christianized farmers that the boarding school policy had envisioned. They returned as broken human beings, lacking the skills, the knowledge, the community, the family, and the cultures of those who were educated in their own cultural contexts. Many of these students found themselves stuck, rejected by white society on the one hand, and their communities on the other. Now, unfortunately, some students never returned. And at the Carlisle School, for instance, 190 students are still buried in the Carlisle Cemetery. And their remains and the remains of students at boarding school cemeteries throughout the country have never been returned. Now, this brings me to one of those legal mechanisms that's available to communities, tribes, and families to help start the healing process, and that's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA for short. Now, one purpose of NAGPRA, was to stop the desecration and robbing of Native American graves and cultural sites, a practice that had become quite profitable for antiquities dealers. But the other purpose is to identify those federal agencies and museums with collections of Native American artifacts or Native American remains, to inventory those collections, identify potential claimants to items in those collections, and return them. And this includes the return and repatriation of human remains. Thus, NAGPRA provides one legal mechanism, albeit minor, for communities and families with ancestors buried in boarding school cemeteries to get those remains back, to give them a proper burial, and to start the healing process. Now, the legacy of boarding schools within the country is bleak. Countless individuals suffered intergenerational trauma that gets passed from one generation to the next. Substance abuse, diabetes, domestic violence, suicide, these are just some of the long-term effects of the destruction of cultural and family ties. And these legacies aren't just confined to the United States. New Zealand, Canada, and Australia all use the United States boarding school policy as a model for their own indigenous populations. However, each of these nations has at least acknowledged the impact of these policies on those communities. New Zealand offered an official apology to its indigenous communities and has paid damages to individuals and tribes. Canada, in 1998, offered a statement of reconciliation and has paid settlements to people who have suffered abuse at boarding schools. In 2008, Australia issued a formal apology to the stolen generations, the generations of children that, like Native American children in the United States, were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools far away from home. To date, the U.S. has not formally acknowledged its role in operating Indian boarding schools. And we've heard a couple people tonight talk about justice, but yet there's no access to justice for the survivors of boarding schools and their families. The statute of limitations bars suits against the government and some churches that ran boarding schools, and some state legislatures have even passed legislation that would bar suits against churches and priests. So what do we do about this? What do we do about boarding schools and their legacy on Native American communities? Well, first, we take this discussion outside of lecture halls and auditoriums, and we take it into our communities. We shed light on the truth of what happened at the hands of our government. Because only when we take these discussions outside of the confines of special company and special events will people start to take notice. We also take this discussion into the political sphere, where we remind our public officials of the impact of the U.S.'s boarding school policy on Native communities. We, as lawyers and future lawyers, are educated and have access to be able to have these conversations. We ask our political officials to create legal mechanisms through which those survivors and families can access justice. And we demand, at the very least, an acknowledgement of the federal government's role in operating boarding schools, implementing the policy, and destroying Native American families and communities. And finally, we listen. We resist our urge to talk, and we listen. We listen to survivors, we listen to communities, and we let them tell their stories and their experiences. Because that's largely our role in this effort. I'd like to finish tonight with a story from Luther Standing Bear, a former student at the Carlisle Industrial School, a Native American historian and scholar, and former chief of the Oglala Lakota. The white men came into our community that day, and they called a meeting with the parents. They wanted to take the boys and the girls and take them to a faraway place about which we knew nothing. I consented at once, though I had no idea what they wanted to do with us except take us far away and kill us. To me, it meant certain death. But I had bravery in my blood, and I did not hesitate. According to the U.S. Census, there are approximately 5 million Native Americans and Alaskan Natives in this country. And the fact that tribal communities and cultures are still alive and thriving in spite of the federal policies aimed at their destruction is a testament to this bravery. And it speaks to the strength and resiliency of Native peoples and Native cultures. We cannot stand by silently. We must let their stories be heard. Because it's not just their history, it's our history. And until we acknowledge that fact, we all remain scarred. Thank you.